In 1979, at the sixth summit of the non-aligned movement, Fidel Castro proposed a resolution that would condemn the Western Bloc as the evil one, as the imperialist one. And that would have been a pretty great fiasco for the reputation of the West had his plan succeeded, and it almost worked. And let me also just clarify why was it such a big deal. The non-aligned movement in the 1960s was still not 55% of the world population, but as the decolonization process was underway and as African countries and Asian countries were gaining their independence from their colonial masters, the non-aligned movement expanded. Here you can see the non-aligned movement at its peak in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, and at that point they were 55% of the world population. They were most of the world, and from their perspective, the Soviets were the ones that helped them during their anti-colonial struggle, and the West was the evil one that colonized them. And they didn't care that much about the fact that West was democratic and had free speech, and that the Soviets were anti-democratic and didn't have free speech, because after all, most countries of the world were not democracies. And those that were often very flawed democracies, such as India. But then why didn't Castro's plan work? Why did the non-aligned movement refuse to condemn the United States and the West as the bad guys? Well, it was mostly because of this guy, Josip Broz Tito. While he was a fanatical communist that condemned US aggression in Vietnam and American war crimes in Vietnam, he was still fanatical about his position that both blocs are equally imperialistic, and he was essentially a conservative force in the non-aligned movement. And his main view was that the non-aligned movement should stay true to its founding ideals, and that was the fact that it was non-aligned. While Castro saw himself as a revolutionary force within a movement that is going to push them to the left. And okay, let me explain two things. Why did Tito have such reputation and so much influence in the non-aligned movement? Because after all, he was a leader of a country of 20 million when compared to countries such as India that had 500 million, and Indonesia that was the most numerous Muslim country in the world. His country seemed insignificant, but it was one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement. And Tito also had a reputation as an anti-fascist fighter, but his ideology was a result of the fact that the Tito-Stalin breakup happened. And for a while, Yugoslavia was in a very uncomfortable position. They didn't have access to the Eastern market, nor did they have access to the Western market. But the United States stepped in and decided to help Yugoslavia. Western markets were open. They were given $1.5 billion of help, of economic help, and Tito was grateful to the United States. And that was part of the clean strategy formulated by George Kennan, the famous US Sovietologist, that wanted to use Yugoslavia as a magnet for other Eastern European dictatorships. He hoped that all the other Eastern European communist countries will start following the example of Tito, being independent communists. And while his plan didn't work, his plan worked in a much more bizarre way, in which even he didn't expect it. George Kennan, that is. And Tito, in the end, became extremely useful to the United States as one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement and one of the supreme defenders of the conservative position within a movement, and that is that both blocs are actually equally imperialistic. And here you can see the the main points of agreement between all non-aligned countries. And by the way, in the 80s, the non-aligned movement sort of lost its significance because there was too much war between members of the non-aligned countries, and as the Cold War was nearing its end, the whole non-aligned movement was also slightly beginning to lose its purpose, although the movement actually still exists today. And what is bizarre to me as a guy from Croatia is that this idea of the non-aligned movement being founded was actually agreed upon on this small Croatian island, Brijuni, between Tito, Nasser and Nehru. And what's funny about it is that Nasser was leader of the Arab world, Nehru was Indian prime minister, and then we have Yugoslavia, a country of 20 million people. And Yugoslavia had such reputation, well, because of two things. Number one, Tito was a European leader, and at the time that was a big deal. Europe was still seen as cradle of civilization, while the rest of the world was seen as barbaric by many. And back then, being from Europe just gave you reputation, and Tito was also famous as an anti-fascist leader that actually did fight on the battlefield with his men during World War II. And that is how he became one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement. And the fact that he was one of the founding members gave him a lot of reputation within the movement, as did his almost, one could say, Don Quixotean attempts to help Algeria in their brutal struggle against the French. He even sent a Yugoslav photographer, Stefan Lazarevic, to film the brutality of the war. Here you can see the Foreign Legion corpse that was turned into a scarecrow. Here you can see the bones of the former Foreign Legion fighter that the Algerian troops turned into a scarecrow, and here you can see some other Lazarevic photographers from the Algerian war. But yeah, Tito is also, he was the first European leader that recognized the independence of Algeria in 1961, before most of the countries recognized independence of Algeria. And Tito also supported FLN, Algerian nationalist movement that fought against the French. And Yugoslavia was even caught by the French sending 148 tons of military equipment of help towards FLN, or the Algerian Liberation Front. And the war was made additionally brutal by a long history of colonialism in Algeria. But let us get back to the main point of this video, and that is Tito managed to gain cult status within a movement by helping Algeria and by being one of the founding members of the movement. But Castro also had a cult movement because of his expeditions in Angola. He is one of the most responsible for Angola gaining independence from the Portuguese occupation. And here you can see the Cuban propaganda posters. And what's also important is the fact that the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia happened, and that was also used by Tito as an argument against the Soviets not being imperialist, not to mention that Yugoslavia at many points in history actually feared Stalin attacking them. And there even is an interesting debate about why Stalin never in fact did attack Yugoslavia after the Tito-Stalin breakup. Some think that he didn't do it because then the Soviets would have been openly shown as imperialists in front of the world, and in case of Czechoslovakia, Stalin had an excuse of a few members of the Czechoslovakian Central Committee actually calling the Soviets to invade, while in Yugoslavia that didn't happen. But others claim that it was simply the fact that the United States State Secretary at one point claimed that United States will respond with military force if the Soviets invade Yugoslavia. That was probably also an important factor, but Dubček, in his liberal reforms, in his attempt to create communism with free speech in Czechoslovakia, was inspired by Tito and his liberal reforms that didn't go as far. And after the Soviets invaded, because they were afraid of free speech, they lost reputation and they began to be seen by European communists as imperialists. And that is how the Euro-communist movement was founded. And again, Tito played an important role in this event, because the Yugoslav model initially inspired Dubček to try to do the same or something similar. And Eurocommunism is essentially this idea that communism is compatible with democracy, and that communist regimes or communist parties should only use democracy as a way of gaining power. They should win elections like Allende did in Chile. And the Soviets, having lost their reputation due to their invasion of Czechoslovakia, were in a harder place to make the argument that the other side is imperialist, or the Soviets were doing it through Castro. But it is still fun to think about what would have happened had Tito, for example, died or not been present there at that particular day. It is very much possible that, and by the way, all of these are the Euro-communist parties, the Japanese, Venezuelan, Mexican, but it is very much possible that the entire world would condemn the Americans as the evil ones. And by the way, Gorbachev himself was also inspired by the Euro-communist movement in the end. And it is interesting to think about whether or not the Cold War would have ended in a different way if 55% of the world condemned the Americans and the West as imperialists. And I personally think that, well, probably not, because Soviet economic problems still would have existed. And Gorbachev's reforms probably would have led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union anyway, but we would probably teach history in a different way, because even the anti-communist historians in that timeline would simply have to admit that there was a point at which most countries in the world condemned the West as the bad guys in the Cold War, and that would put people in the West in a pretty uncomfortable position. They could claim all they want. The West could claim that they are not imperialists, but they would be unable to escape from the simple fact that the non-aligned movement, that is supposed to be objective, and as the name says, non-aligned, proclaim them to be the evil ones. But as I already said, that didn't happen, mostly because of the famous speech that Tito held and that conference that proclaimed that the non-aligned movement should in fact stay non-aligned. Okay, if you like this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content like this.